Welcome. Formerly Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and president of the UN Security Council, Kishore Mahbubani, will be joining us today to discuss his new book, Has China Won? We're very grateful and excited to have him with us today. In your upcoming book, Has China Won? You state that a US-China conflict is avoidable but inevitable. Why do you think this is the case?
That's what you call partly the logic of history, that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which is China today, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which is United States, it's a very natural reaction of the number one power to try and suppress or thwart the rise of the emerging power. So there is a sort of a built-in geopolitical impulse that's about 2,000 years old. And I think to some extent, Graham Allison has spoken about it. But of course, unlike Graham Allison, who believes that war is more likely than not, I don't think war is likely at all. But the struggle will be played out in many dimensions, economic, political, cultural, military. So it's a multi-dimensional struggle. And so what my book tries to do is to point out how you got to understand all the different dimensions if you're going to understand what's happening in the US-China geopolitical contest.
Some people have been comparing the future US-China conflict you mentioned to the Cold War. Why do you think this conflict is unlike the Cold War?
That's actually a very good question, because unfortunately, people like to be intellectually lazy. And they would like to just take, let's say, oh, this happened in the Cold War, so we can just live through it again. But China is not the Soviet Union, right? In many fundamental ways. Number one, China is not trying to export any ideology to the rest of the world. And that's why, going back to your first question, I say that this contest is avoidable, because China is not saying that its system is superior to the American system. They're saying the American system is good for America. The Chinese system is good for China. We choose our own systems. So, and unlike Khrushchev, who threatened to bury the United States, China has no desire to bury the United States. China will be happy to see a strong United States with which it could trade and do business with, and so on and so forth. And the second fundamental difference between China and the Soviet Union is that it was possible for the United States to carry out a containment policy against Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union barely traded with the rest of the world. So none of the neighbors of Soviet Union outside the Warsaw Pact were in any way interlinked with the Soviet Union's economy. By contrast, I don't know the latest figure, but over 100, maybe over 120 countries in the world do more trade with China than they do with the United States. So paradoxically, if the United States tried to carry out a containment policy on China, it will be containing itself, because most countries in the world will continue trading with China. So this is another fundamental difference from the Cold War. And the third fundamental difference is that, the Soviet Union made a huge mistake in thinking this was primarily a military competition, and therefore it focused on the military dimension, trying to keep pace with the United States, and ignored the economy. And I think China learned some very powerful lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one powerful lesson it learned is that, is the economy stupid? So China is focused on economic growth. And as you know, in my book, I say that in many ways, the Chinese are happy that the US defense budget keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the US is burning millions of dollars every day maintaining aircraft carriers, because, that's actually what the mistake that the Soviet Union made. The competition within China and United States will not be in the military sphere, it'll be in the economic sphere. And here, as you know, sadly, the biggest mistake that the United States is making is one of complacency. it assumes that it will, of course, be more competitive economically than China. But, frankly, as I document in great detail in the book, there's some very painful, dysfunctional aspects of American society that have to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, America will have serious problems in the decades to come. So it's a much more difficult struggle than the one the United States undertook with Soviet Union. But the contrast here is that while the United States, especially led by George Kennan, thought very deeply about how you fight this contest with the Soviet Union, the American strategic thinkers didn't even think before launching this geopolitical contest against China. So in that sense, my book is actually a gift to the United States. It's a way of saying, please think very carefully before you plunge into this geopolitical contest.
You mentioned that there are painful, dysfunctional aspects of American society that need to be addressed. Can you elaborate on these dysfunctional aspects and what it would take to address them?
The most shocking statistic about the United States is that it is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And that, what you call that statistic, is obviously behind it. There are many, many sad stories. And so, what kept America very vibrant and strong for many decades in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, is that the American economy kept growing, the living standards of the American middle class got better, and people felt a sense of hope and optimism for the future. Now, I quote these two Princeton social scientists, Case and Deaton, who say there's a sea of despair among the white working classes in America. It is, as you know, the sea of despair that led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And the remarkable thing is neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are trying to address this sea of despair and find some concrete ways of helping them.
Following the election of Donald Trump, the trade war and tensions between the US and China seem to be moving in a bad direction. Why do you think the trade war happened and what might it lead to?
The sad part about this trade war is that, whatever President Trump does, he gets attacked by the Democrats, everything, except for one thing. When he launched his trade war with China, the Democrats came around saying, hooray, 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 good for you, Donald Trump, we are behind you. And I know, as you know, I quote many Democratic figures who support Donald Trump in this trade war. And to some extent, it's understandable because, as I say in the book, the Chinese have made serious mistakes in the economic sphere. They have unwisely, unnecessarily alienated the American business community. And in the past, the American business community would put brakes on whenever a trade war was launched. But now nobody's putting the brakes on. So to some extent, this trade war is understandable because China has alienated the American business community. But at the same time, when the Trump administration, and to some extent the Democrats who support the Trump administration, decide to support this trade war, they didn't think about what would be the consequences. Then did they expect China to buckle and surrender when this trade war was launched? And this could never happen because this is where history is very important. I talk about the 100 years of humiliation that China has suffered. And, China was bullied by the Western powers on issues of trade from the Opium War in 1842. So when the United States just tried to use bullying tactics against China, the Chinese would, of course, not bend and buckle. So as you know, they have taken a relatively strong stand. And even though Trump kept increasing the tariffs. The Chinese said, okay, carry on, And today, frankly, when you look at what's happened after COVID-19, where it is the United States now which is in a more vulnerable position, and I actually argue that it would be better for Trump to immediately lift all his tariffs on China as one way of boosting market confidence in the future after COVID-19 recedes.
What is it about China's government and China's development model that makes it so resilient and successful?
I devote an entire chapter to how China is governed. And I think there's some fundamental mistakes in the understanding of China. For example, many people think that the way China is run is like the sclerotic Soviet Communist Party, a group of old men who stay in office till they die, But by contrast, the Chinese government is one of the most meritocratic governments in the world, probably number 2 after Singapore in terms of its selection of talent to run the country. And so it has a very strong, dynamic, smart government that is able to handle problems that are thrown at it. So for example, let's say, for example, if you look at I compare the diplomats in China and the diplomats of America. 30 years ago, American diplomats were smarter, more sophisticated, more aware of what's happening in the world. And when I first met a Chinese diplomat 50 years ago, all he could do was pull out Mao's little red book from his pocket and read it out to me, But today you fast forward to 2020 and wherever you go, it's a sad fact that unfortunately the US State Department is very demoralized today, very demoralized. And it actually predates Trump. Of course, Trump has made it worse with his recent choice of Secretaries of State, Tillerson and Pompeo, but it's been the long-term trend towards demoralization. By contrast, the Chinese diplomatic service is now full of extremely smart, bright people who speak many languages, who can tweet and go on social media and can engage the rest of the world. So, it is a mistake. I think the confusing thing is that the Americans like to focus on the word Chinese Communist Party. And they think, oh, this is just like the communists of the past. But the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, actually stands for the Chinese Civilization Party. And the goal of these Chinese leaders is to once again strengthen Chinese civilization, and they have a deep cause and they're dedicated to it, and they overall are doing a very good job.
What do you think of free speech and democracy-based criticism from China?
It's clear that China is not a democracy. It's clear that China doesn't have the same kind of free speech as America does, as Europe does. I mean, these are undeniable facts. But when people compare where they are today, the first thing they ask themselves is where they came from. And I actually saw where China came from. I first went to China exactly 40 years ago in 1980. And when I went to China in 1980, the Chinese people couldn't choose where to live, where to work. They couldn't choose what to wear, what to study. And certainly no Chinese could ever travel overseas as tourists. There was zero tourists leaving China. That was 40 years ago. Today, you go to China, people can choose where to live, where to work. They no longer wear Maoist suits. In fact, you want some of the best fashions, go to Shanghai. And they certainly can choose where to study. And each year, about 300,000 young Chinese come to study in America. And each year, for a country that is technically not free, 134 million Chinese leave China freely and go overseas. And certainly if China was a dark, oppressive communist regime, 134 million Chinese wouldn't return to China freely. But each year they vote with their feet and go back to China. So there's been, while China doesn't enjoy the political freedoms that are enjoyed in Europe and United States, the Chinese people have seen an explosion of personal freedoms. And so the Chinese people feel much better about themselves. And, if you look at the levels of optimism, the Chinese people are far more optimistic for the future than American people are. And this is, how is it that the people who are not supposed to be free feel happier and more optimistic? So there's a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of Americans in their understanding of China.
Is China on a path toward a more democratic and open society?
It's very hard to predict what will happen in China. But I think the Chinese have learned a very powerful lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev thought that you could sort of introduce democracy instantly, and you saw the result. The Soviet Empire crumbled. The living standards of the Russian people went down, poverty went up, life expectancy went down, infant mortality went up. So the Russian people suffered a lot. So I think the one lesson the Chinese have learned is that even if the Chinese move towards democracy, they're going to do so very slowly and very carefully, and not try to make a big plunge, in that direction. So I think the critical thing is that at the same time, as you know, United States has tried to export democracy, and ironically export democracy by sending US troops in to Iraq, to Libya, and there have been catastrophic failures. In fact, if you read George Kennan, whom I quote in the book, he points out that it's a fundamental mistake for the Americans to believe that they can influence the course of how other societies could evolve. I mean, that was remarkable arrogance on the part of America. And the shocking thing is that even though American efforts to export democracy have failed, America is still trying to do so. The wisest thing that America could do is to allow other countries to decide how they evolve, allow China to decide how it's going to evolve, and don't assume that America, a country that is less than 250 years old, can influence the course of what happens to China, which has got 4 times the population and a history of 3,000 to 4,000 years. So it's a bit arrogant for Americans to believe that they have either the legal or moral duty to try to help China out.
Last question, and an important question. What do you think it's going to take for America to realize it's wrong about many of its assumptions about China? And what do you think it's going to take for America to improve?
The most important thing that Americans need to do, and I say this very seriously, is to read my book. Because, and it's a serious point, because I think it presents a perspective that is just not present in the current debate on China within the American body politic. Sadly, there's a new kind of hysteria towards China. And as you know, one of the politically sensitive things I raise in my book is that some of this anger towards China is a result of the deeply buried, what I call the yellow peril dimension in the Western imagination. And it's the fear, the yellow peril that is now surfacing. And it explains some of the very nasty, condescending, insulting statements that Americans make about China. And I think one small piece of advice that I would give to Americans is don't insult China. It's not wise. I mean, you may disagree with what they're doing. Let the Chinese decide. And what's interesting is that if you look around the world, no other country in the world, not one, insults China.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I'd also recommend reading Has China Won? I really enjoyed it, and it presents a perspective I think a lot of people could gain from.